Good evening. Merry Christmas. My name is Mark Matney. I am a member here at University Baptist Church. I've been here for more than 30 years, my wife and I. Normally, you see me right over here playing my French horn in the horn section in the orchestra. And if you love Christmas music, which I do, and it's not Christmas without French horns, by the way. Next Sunday morning, both services, we're going to be playing the choir and the orchestra, so you don't want to miss it. It's just not Christmas without choir and orchestra. I said there's three things you need for Christmas: French horns, an oboe, and children singing. So there you go. I get my fix every year. Just to give you a background, I'm kind of introduced myself. Will said by the way, I thank Will for letting me use his pulpit. I've been here 30 years and I've never spoken from here before, so at least not in front of a crowd. I got an interest in space in high school, and through some connections, I started working at the Noble Planetarium in Fort Worth, Texas, and really enjoyed planetarium work. I just love astronomy. And I went to Texas Christian University in Fort Worth. I'm a Horned Frog, and studied astronomy and physics. And then when I was done, I went to graduate school. I came down here to Rice University in the Space Physics and Astronomy Department and got my PhD here. And ever since then, I've worked here at NASA. I am an orbital debris scientist, which means I'm a space junk scientist. And a friend of mine used to call, maybe it was John, used to call me the Fred Sanford of NASA. So some of y'all recognize that reference. So to turn the clock back, when I was at the Planetarium in Fort Worth, every Christmas we would do the Christmas Star Show. It's a standard December planetarium show all about the Christmas star. And of course, we'll talk about it in a minute, but the theories are legion in those days when we did planetarium shows, we actually did things. Now they're all canned, they're all electronic, but we actually would run special effects and run the stars and everything. And so we had to pay attention, because if you fell asleep, something wouldn't happen. And I distinctly remember one of the shows, and it talked about the star, and we'll talk about this in a minute, and it said, no astronomical event does this. And I remember sitting there one time going, I think I know one. And it just kind of stuck in the back of my head. So fast forward, I came to work at NASA, I'm working, I find a paper about some of the stuff we're going to talk about, and my interest started picking up. So I think it was three years ago, 3 Christmases ago, I had a nice long Christmas break. I said, I'm going to sit down and figure this thing out. And what you see is the fruit of that labor. Now, if you go on the internet and if you go to books and articles, there are actually only a handful of theories out there. People retread the same theories. But what you're going to hear tonight is new. So I presented it for the first time last year. How many of y'all were here last year? Brave people. Okay. So they clearly found it interesting enough that they'd like to come back. And so what you're going to hear tonight is not a standard, I'm not preaching, I'm telling a science story. But it has to do with the Bible, it has to do with the history of Christianity, and it has to do with the seasonal aspect. And so it's lots of great things all tied up in one. So let's get started, shall we? Because I work at NASA, I need to put the boilerplate here. This is my work, and it doesn't reflect the view of NASA or the United States government. With that said, now we proceed. By the way, that's a picture I took in Milan, and a wonderful picture of the 4 wise men. And I said last year, one of them is bringing the fruitcake. So there have been more than 400 papers and books written on this topic, believe it or not. The first modern scientific theory was proposed by none other than Johannes Kepler, the fellow that figured out the motions of the planets. And so why another study? I mean, do you think after 400 books and articles, people would have figured this out? Well, first of all, it's a very interesting overlap of faith, history, and astronomy. It's very popular astronomy. In fact, it's one of the most popular astronomy subjects out there. There are planetarium shows, there are documentaries, the news media picks up on it. There's a great deal of public curiosity. And despite the work of countless astronomers and scholars, there's no consensus. There's no one answer. They may say there is, but there isn't. And so my idea was, can I add something new to this field? So here's my humble contribution. The assumptions we're going to go with tonight. The first assumption is we will treat the Bible text as a historical document at face value. I think that's a fair way to approach things. And by the end, you'll be able to decide, is that a fair assumption? Is that assumption justified? And we're only going to address the nativity story in Matthew, not the one in Luke. There's a lot of interesting historical puzzles, and it's a very complex puzzle. But we don't have time to unpack that. And as you'll see, we're going to be packing to fit in what we have to. So we're going to stick with just the story in Matthew's gospel. So those are the assumptions we will proceed with. So let's just read the passage, because let's face it, we've seen Christmas specials and Christmas cards and heard cantatas and songs, and if you like me, you love all that. But I think we need to strip away. Christmas is a little bit like a Christmas tree. You have the tree, but we hang a lot of things on it. And some of those things may not be quite accurate, even though they're pretty and we enjoy them. So let's just strip this down to the bare story. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who's been born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. And they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. When they had gone, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream. "Get up," he said, "take the child and his mother and escape to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to kill him." So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and left for Egypt, where he stayed until the death of Herod. And so was fulfilled what the Lord had said through the prophet, "Out of Egypt I called my son." When Herod realized that he had been outwitted by the Magi, he was furious, and he gave orders to kill all the boys in Bethlehem and its vicinity who were 2 years old and under, in accordance with the time he had learned from the Magi. Then what was said through the prophet Jeremiah was fulfilled. "A voice is heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children and refusing to be comforted, because they are no more." That's it. That's the whole story of the star. It doesn't appear in Luke. It doesn't appear anywhere else in the Bible. And we add a lot of things, like I said, to that story. It's a very short, concise story. So let's break it apart. Now, this is the part that gets a little technical, because we're going to go into some of the Greek, because I think it's useful. So let's start with King Herod. Who was King Herod? He was the Roman client king of Judea. He was a creature of Rome. He was actually an Idumean, an Edomite, so he wasn't even a Jew, although he converted to Judaism. He was tolerated because he kept the Romans off their back. But it turns out he was a cruel, paranoid, brutal king, especially later in life. Now, according to the writer Flavius Josephus, Herod died about 4 BC. Now, there's some scholars who say that Herod died in 1 BC. I did a deep dive on Josephus, looking carefully at all the evidence. It seems to me that Josephus himself believed that Herod died in 4 BC. He may have made a mistake. But for the purposes of this study, it doesn't matter if Herod died at 4 BC or 1 BC, as long as he was still alive a little bit earlier than 4 BC. So I don't have to get into that argument. After Jesus was born, the Magi, all right. The Magi, we all grew up calling them wise men, right? Wise men, sages, scholars. The Greek word is magoi. I like to call them the 3 scholars. And magoi is plural. We'll get to that in a second. The story of the Magi is very complex, but at this time in history, Roman sources are clear that they associated with dream interpretation, with omens, and with astrology. And you see that in the biblical text. They had dreams, so they interpreted dreams. And by the way, just for an aside, you've heard of astronomy and astrology. Astronomy is the science of the behavior and nature of objects in space, planets, stars, and things. astrology is a belief system that the motions of objects in space influence or reflect actions on Earth. Okay. At this time, those were interlinked. Sometime in the modern scientific age, they diverged. Okay. So when someone was an astrologer, they had to be an astronomer in those days. And some of the astronomers were actually quite knowledgeable. They actually figured out a lot of interesting things about the motion of the sky. They were no dummies. Also, they were known, it's interesting, we know that they were known as kingmakers. They had a major role in legitimizing royal successions, hence their interest in a king of the Jews. So even though they were subordinate to the kings were a little worried about them because they could sort of influence things. So how many magi were there? 3, right? We all know the 3 kings. Well, we don't know how many. All we know is they were plural. There was at least 2. Some traditions say there were 12. Of course, the Western traditions, there were 3. And the 3 comes from probably that there were 3 gifts. Gold, frankincense, and myrrh, 3 magi. Okay. And they were from the east, literally from the east, plural, meaning geography. They were from the eastern realms. Now, the Magi began as a tribal group under the old Persian Empire, but during this period, they functioned as officials for the government of the Parthian Empire. Okay? We're going to test your history knowledge if you were paying attention to history. By the way, I told them the joke that poor Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer got bad grades this semester because apparently he went down in history. So it turns out from 20 BC to 2 BC, there was an unprecedented period of peace between the Parthian and Roman Empire. So let's see if this works. I have put together some things. This is the realm of the Parthian Empire. So that's over on the left is Jerusalem. You can, I got my laser. So there's Jerusalem. Here's Judea here. And Parthia controlled what we now understand as Iran and Mesopotamia, Iraq. That was the area they controlled. And they were the alternate superpower of the day. The Romans and the Parthians were like this all the time. They were the only country that could stand up to the powerful Romans. All right, so I took that chart from last year and I've expanded it. So time goes up. So we'll start back here in the 50s BC. And if you remember from your history class, there was a fellow named Crassus. And Crassus was part of the first triumvirate with Pompey and Julius Caesar. Crassus decided that he was going to go east and fight a war with the Parthians. He did. He was trapped at the Battle of Carrhae, and up to 30,000 Roman soldiers were killed or captured. And what was important was not only the men, but they captured their standards, they were almost worshipped by the Roman army. Julius Caesar died. The Parthians invaded Syria, and the governor Lucius Decidius Saxa at Antioch, they defeated him. They captured Syria. They actually occupied Jerusalem and put a puppet king on the throne of Jerusalem. And a few years later, Herod the Great was able to oust him and become king of Judea. Mark Antony decided, since Julius Caesar had been planning an invasion, a retribution, get back at those Parthians for what they'd done to Crassus. He was assassinated. Mark Antony tried to do it, and 30,000 of his soldiers were killed by the Parthians. So you can see you don't want to mess with the Parthians. They're kind of scary. Then Mark Antony and Cleopatra fought Octavian at the Battle of Actium. If you've seen the movie Cleopatra, it's with the ships. And, of course, Octavian became Caesar Augustus and became ruler of the whole world. We all know Caesar Augustus from the Nativity story in Luke. All right, we fast forward to the year 20 BC. Augustus negotiates a peace treaty with the Parthian king Phraates IV. And the legionary standards are returned, which is a big, big deal. They got them back. And so while Phraates lived, there was this period of peace. And it was the most peaceful the two nations had been ever and would ever be again. It was this narrow window of time that they were at peace. And somewhere in that time period is when Jesus was born. So I've got Herod the Great dying here at 4 BC. The Parthian king dies in 2 BC. So somewhere 5, 6, 7 is a good place to look for the birth of Jesus. And the Magi asked, where is the one who's been born king of the Jews? There was something about the star that made them think a king. Actually, it's literally one who's been born king of the Judeans. A king of the Judeans had been born. But what? Well, we'll figure that out. Okay. And of course, the word star. A lot of people get hung up on the words for star. In Greek, it's the word aster, which means a light in the sky. Now, today, stars are distant, hot balls of gas. They're more than that, but they're that we see in the nighttime sky. But in the ancient world, star meant light. It meant a light in the sky. And it could be any bright object in the sky. It could be stars. It could be planets. They called them wandering stars. In fact, the word planets comes from the Greek planetes, which means wanderer. They had one of the ancient groups called meteors jumping stars. I like that, or shooting stars. And then comets were known as hairy stars. So there were different kinds of, but they all were considered stars. So we don't want to be too precise. It meant a light in the sky. And it says, we saw. Now, this is where we get into the Greek. The word there is eidamen, which is the Greek aorist. Now, the Greek aorist, it means, can mean one of two things usually. It either means we saw it at one point in the past. We saw it once. Or it could mean we saw it and then we began to see it and then continued to see it. It can mean either one. And you have to determine it from context. That's called the ingressive aorist. And the context will come later. So hold on to that thought. It either means they saw it once, and a lot of people make a big deal out of seeing it once, seeing it a second time. But it seems likely, well, you'll see in a minute. I don't want to steal my thunder, my own thunder here. Let's see. When it rose. Now, if you grew up, learning the King James, it says, for we saw his star in the east. And a lot of people ponder why. What if they star in the east? Well, the word there's anatole, which means literally in the east singular, which actually is a technical astronomical term that means when it rose. And it could have been a technical term, what was called the heliacal rising, or it could just be like anything rises. So if you go out any night, objects, the moon, the planets, the stars, they rise in the east. Which way's east from here? They rise in the east and they set in the west. That's what they all do because it's the Earth rotation. Except for the stars near the North Pole. They all rise in the east and set in the west. So it's sort of a standard thing. And to the astrologers, that was important when it rose and so forth. So they paid attention to those things. And they said to worship him. And a lot of people have drawn, well, they believed in the deity of Christ. They may have, but it turns out the word there is what's called proskinesis. And that's where a person bows down to show proper reverence to a royal figure. But so it's not necessarily a divine figure. The Magi themselves may have only think, well, this is a prince, he's a king. We're going to show him homage. And then it says, Herod was disturbed. Now, a lot of people take this to mean that Herod didn't know about the star. Disturbed means troubled or upset. Now, remember his political enemies, the Parthians, were in town. These Parthian Magi were in town. And Augustus had given him strict instructions to keep the peace. So that makes him nervous. He doesn't want to give a cause for war. And another thing, they tell him that the star is of a king that's not of his line, which, as you might expect, he didn't like that very much. So there's really no evidence at all that anyone else saw the star or didn't see the star. It doesn't say. What they didn't know was the interpretation of the star, because that's what made Herod upset. And then it also says, and all Jerusalem with him. Remember, the people were aware of Herod's reputation, jealousy, rage, violence. And the last time the Parthians were in town, they'd occupied Jerusalem for 3 years and causing political chaos. So it was a mess. So you could see why they were a bit upset. There we go. All right. And he says, Herod asked the teachers where the Messiah was to be born, the anointed one. We don't know if the Magi thought of Jesus as the Messiah, but we know that Herod jumped to that interpretation. Okay. And Herod asked them the exact time the star appeared. The exact time there is ton chronon, the time or the duration. Chronon, where we get the word chronometer or chronology. The star had appeared. This is a little more Greek. Tu phenomenou asteros, of the appearing star. This is actually in the present participle, whereas the aorist is ambiguous. The present participle is not. It means the star that continually appears, that keeps appearing. And appearing can even mean rising. So putting those two words together, we saw the star in the past, And since then, it's been continually appearing each night. Okay? The star, and of course, they set out for set out for Bethlehem, and the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them. Now, this is the part where a lot of people get hung up on. So, the Greek is actually very plain. The star was in front of them as they were marching out. Let's see. I'll go back. And then it says, until arriving, it stopped. The star came to a noticeable stop. Over, is the word there, the preposition is directly over, presumably near the zenith, which is the direction straight up. So they're walking out of Jerusalem, and the star is in front of them. And as they walk to Bethlehem, the star, apparently, Matthew's saying, the star moved into a position directly over them. And it says directly over the place where the child was. Now, the place where is actually a vague location. Actually, the Greek there is where the child was. It's kind of vague. Now, a lot of people historically have just assumed that it pointed out the exact house. And that's a strong tradition that actually point out, it's this house right here. And I will tell you right now, if that's what Matthew means, no astronomical object can really point out a house. That can. But it's very vague. Could mean Bethlehem. It's just overhead when they arrived in Bethlehem. Also, the word child, and some of you know this, the child there is the word paidion. It's a child between the ages of circumcision and about 2 or 3 years old. So it's a little one. It could be a young baby or it could be a toddler, but it's not a newborn. All right. So it turns out that the trip, we got Google Earth, right? The trip from Jerusalem to Bethlehem is actually not very far. If you walk the distance, it's about 2 hours. It's basically, if we set out after our presentation tonight and decided to walk to Baybrook Mall, that's about the distance. You could do it in a couple of hours. Don't recommend it, but you could do it. And notice the road is relatively straight. It's slightly west of south. South is azimuth 180 degrees, so it's a couple of degrees to the right of south. So if we're looking for an object that was in front of them, we want to look at an object that stayed at about that azimuth and gradually rising as they walked the 2 to 3 hours. And it depends on camel traffic, you know, how busy it is. And then after he realized he'd been fooled by the Magi, he decided to kill the children 2 years old and younger based on the timing of the star. Apparently, the Magi had been observing the star for an extended period. This is our only chronology that we get from it. For Herod's estimate, the age of the child was linked to the star's appearance. Okay, that's the breakdown, the Greek there. Let's see what it actually is. So the story doesn't actually tell us when Jesus was born precisely, other than it occurred before Herod died and before the Magi showed up. Okay? Herod, and perhaps the Magi too, certainly thought that the birth of the new king was marked by the appearance of the star, but Matthew doesn't explicitly say that. We just know it happened before. Okay? Second thing, Matthew does not say the star led the Magi from the east to Jerusalem. It simply says, we saw the star and we showed up in Jerusalem. It wasn't a celestial GPS, at least on the first part of the trip. The only mention of direction and of motion of the star is that short trip from Jerusalem to Bethlehem. All right, summary. Magi, astronomers, astrologers from the east, probably within the Parthian Empire, first observed the star when it rose. That's what it said. For some reason, they concluded that this was the star heralding the birth of a new king of the Judeans and were convinced to begin a journey to Jerusalem. They most likely continued to observe the appearing star as they made their trek to Jerusalem, but there was no indication that it led them or otherwise indicated direction yet. They likely arrived in Jerusalem some months after their initial observation. And when they reached Herod, when news reached Herod that the Magi had arrived and that they interpreted the appearance of the star as indicating a birth of a king, this upset the unstable Herod and consequently the people of Jerusalem. Herod instructed the Magi to go to Bethlehem and search for the new king based on a quick Bible lesson he got from his religious scholars. And while on the road to Bethlehem, the Magi once again observed the star. The star stayed in front of them as they traveled, staying at an azimuth just west of south for several hours and gradually gaining in elevation. And when they arrived in Bethlehem, the star reached a position nearly overhead where it appeared to stop for some time. Based on the Magi reporting how long they observed the star, then Herod ordered the children 2 years old and younger to be executed. So that's the basic outline of the story, if we're going to make a scientific, historical observation on that. All right, there are 3 common astronomical theories. Actually, I read somewhere that every single object in the sky at one time or another has probably been postulated as the star Bethlehem. So the one that's very popular is a supernova, or nova. That's a new star, an exploding star that becomes very bright in the sky for a period of weeks or months. That's like I said, that's a very popular theory. The second theory is actually probably the most popular theory, that it was something about the movement of planets. And we know that astrologers would have noted the motion of planets. They kept up with that all the time. And unfortunately, there are multiple planetary conjunctions during the time period, and there's really no consensus. People will say, oh, it was this one or it was that one, but the mere fact that there are different ones means that they haven't centered on any particular answer. By the way, that was from a few years ago when Jupiter and Saturn were close together. Some of y'all may have seen that. The third one is that it was a comet, a bright visitor to the inner solar system that appears to move through the constellations. Now, the good thing about planets and comets is they move. Novas don't move, okay? Contrary to popular belief, comets do not flash across the sky. They slowly move among the background stars in typically long-period elliptical orbits around the sun over a period of weeks or months. So the time frame's about right. They last for a while. Comets are composed of ice and dust and rock. And when they get in close to the sun, they heat up, and that ice starts to evaporate like dry ice does. So it's got water and carbon dioxide ice. That tends to form what's called a coma. And then the actions of the sun tend to blow out that material and form really 2 tails, a dust tail and a gas tail. Okay? And they can be quite bright. So here's the problem. Matthew's description of the star stopping directly over, I'm afraid, is a major difficulty. The description is quite clear and straightforward, as Christians have known for 2,000 years. And astronomical phenomena typically do behave like that. Just like in my Planetarium show, no astronomical phenomena behaves that way. Objects rise in the east, and they set in the west. So it's led 3 ways for scholars to deal with this. 1, it's a myth. If it's not historical, then searching for a natural explanation is no point in it, right? Second one, many Christians through the years said, well, the event was miraculous. It's a very common belief, but again, if it's miraculous, then it's unnecessary to look for a natural explanation. And I'm not going to tell you that my explanation is correct. It's an option. It could have been miraculous. I have no way of knowing. But the description to me sounds like a simple astronomical description. And there's nothing in the story about the star that indicates that it's necessarily miraculous. It's unusual, but there's nothing that requires it to be miraculous, other than the motion. The third one is astronomers trying to fit the square peg into the round hole will bend the language and stretch it a little bit to try and fit their astronomical theory in there. So an example, it's very common to think that the stopping refers to the pausing of a planet's motion among the stars as it changes direction. It's called retrograde motion. It's a big deal. But that doesn't match the description of the star. It seemed to be before them and then above them. But is it really true that, quote, no astronomical phenomenon behaves this way? I plan to give you option 4. There's a possibility exists that a previously unrecognized, despite centuries of people working on this, natural astronomical phenomena does fit the biblical explanation. All right, I know you're all waiting. So what sort of phenomena could stand over a particular point on the Earth? Now, it turns out that we have a number of objects around the Earth called geosynchronous satellites. How many of you guys have a satellite dish or have had a satellite dish? They're kind of going extinct, aren't they? Does the satellite dish have to track? No, you point it and it points. That's because these satellites are launched into an orbit where their period exactly matches the rotation of the Earth. So from a fixed point on the Earth, they always stay in one spot. Now, if you go to the equator, which is what they orbit over the equator, you can find the right longitude, and you will find that there may be a satellite directly over your head 24/7. Okay? That is a natural object, that's a man-made object that could stand over a location, but only on the equator and only a satellite. Okay? But I thought about this. I said, what if it's a slightly different kind of object? What if we have an interplanetary object that passes close to the Earth at just the right speed and just the right distance, that for a couple of hours it stays directly over a point on the Earth? You see how I have my little cartoon here? So there's the object passing by the Earth, and here's an observer, and that's his zenith, his vertical line. Such an object could be called a temporary geosynchronous object for a period of hours. It would pause directly over a point on the rotating Earth for a few hours. Okay, you can see it. There it is, and here's the person on the rotating Earth, and then so there it pauses right overhead. So it could have. This is the idea I came up with in the planetarium so long ago. So what sort of object might that be? It can't be a planet. Planets are too far away. In fact, if a planet came that close, it'd be scary. It'd be a giant thing in the sky. Well, asteroids do that. We hear them all the time. Asteroids come close to the Earth, right? Well, asteroids are very, very dim. They're dark. So they wouldn't have seen it for weeks or months at a time. So it can't be an asteroid. But there is an object, a comet. Comets are asteroid size. They're a couple of miles across. But again, when they come close to the sun, they get that gas expands and they get very, very bright. Now, I'm not the first person to propose a comet. In the 3rd century AD, a fellow named Origen proposed it was a comet. So the question is, were there comets seen in I should have said the last decade BC, the first decade before the change of years? So now we're going to turn to the ancient Chinese annals, known as the history of the former Han Dynasty, called the Hanshu. And in there, this is actually a paraphrase. It's not exactly, actually, you can find it on the internet. You can find the actual original Chinese text on the internet. The 2nd year of the Jianping reign of Emperor Ai of the Han Dynasty, 2nd month, a Hui Sing, pardon my pronunciation, emerged in Qianyu for over 70 days. Now, most of y'all are experts in Chinese astronomy, so you know exactly what I'm talking about. Let's explain that. The 2nd year of the Jianping reign of the Emperor Ai of the Han Dynasty, 2nd month, was the month starting on March 9th to April 6th, 5 BC. Right time, right? Remember if Herod died in 4 BC, this is exactly the right time. Qianyu is a constellation on the ecliptic. It's actually part of our constellation, Capricornus. By the way, the constellation is Capricornus. The zodiac sign is Capricorn. So if you hear me going back and forth, you'll know why. A Hui Sing is a comet, literally a broom star, because they had a tail. Now, I'm not the one that found this Chinese observation. Scientists have known about it, and that's how I found out about it, was reading an article about it. And people have speculated that this was the Christmas star. But I'm going to take it one step farther. So, by the way, I'm going to go back here. That on the right is a Chinese star chart. And you see in the middle, that white section, it turns out from this time period of the Han Dynasty, there was a tomb found with a silk book the pages were made of silk. And in it was a comet, astrologer's comet guide. It had all different shapes of comets and what they meant to the Chinese astrologers. And that's the picture of a Hui Sing. That's their diagram. I just thought that was kind of cool. So, the Hui Sing stayed in a single constellation for more than 70 days. Now, this has been a sticking point because comets move. We talked about that. If it stayed in one spot, well, that's not a comet, is it? And some astronomers believe this refers to a nova. There's actually several astronomers that made their whole thesis about this was a nova or possibly a recurring nova near the constellation of Sagittarius. I'm sorry, the constellation Capricornus. But here's the problem. It's part of the background stars. It doesn't stop overhead. Okay? There we go. How many of you guys are pilots? Anybody pilots in the group? What happens when you're a pilot and an object is not moving this way or this way in the sky? It's heading straight for you, isn't it? Pilots know this, especially fighter pilots know this. If the missile is not moving, it's locked on to you. So if an object's in the sky for 70 days, it's not moving around much, it's heading straight towards the Earth or heading straight away from the Earth, which is interesting because remember that object has to come close to the Earth in order for it to behave that way. And the fact that it stayed in this one position of the sky during a known period of time, I can use that information to construct a comet orbit. Okay? I'll go through this quickly. What I did was create a box. That's the constellation of Chien-Yu. There, I created a box around it, and I chose a time randomly in that month, from March 9th to April 6th, 5 BC. I chose a random position. Then I took a date 35 days after that and chose another random position. Then took a date 70 days after that, chose another random position, took those 3 points, and computed an orbit. And that orbit was using a technique that I developed especially for orbital debris work. So it's one of these things where I got to use something I do for my living to do something interesting over here. And I came up with a whole bunch of possible orbits, but some of them came very, very close to the Earth. So here's some graphs. It's kind of busy. The bottom, it says date of perihelion. That's the date it passes closest to the sun. And the perihelion distance there tells you how close it came to the sun. And the red dot there is the orbit I'm going to talk about. This is the even better one. This shows the date of close approach to the Earth and the distance of close approach to the Earth. And we want something on near 0, right? And there it is, the red dot in the middle of 5 BC. So here's the comet orbit I computed. We start in March. See, there's the comet. Let me get my laser here. So here's the comet right here, and here's the Earth. And I assumed what's called a parabolic orbit, which is an appropriate orbit for deep space objects, for long-period comets. Here's the Earth, and notice the comet is on this path. By the way, you can see its tail. Its tail always points away from the sun. And as you can see, it's getting closer and closer to the Earth, and it's going to swing close past the Earth and then get between the Earth and the sun, where it's difficult to observe. There's the close approach in early June, and then it goes in here. Now, this particular comet orbit comes very, very close to the sun. It's called a sun grazer. And sun grazers typically do not survive the close path of the sun. In fact, we had one this fall, a sun grazer, that disintegrated. It gets so hot that it just falls apart. So likely it disintegrated. So it's likely not around anymore. Now, this one, that's that same chart, except now I draw a line from the Earth to the comet. And you can see the line stays approximately in the same direction for the 70 days. And the comet passes extraordinarily close to the Earth in early June. By the way, the data is insufficient to determine a period on the comet. There's not enough information, not precise enough data. But because I chose a deep space comet, it's likely its period was thousands or many thousands of years. So it's a very unique situation there. Okay. Now, how long does it take the Magi to make this trip? So once again, we use Google Earth. I started at ancient Babylon, which was the center of astronomical learning. And it's about 1,200 kilometers or 275 hours walking. And that's about 38-hour days, something like that. So you could make it in a month or two. And by the way, as you can see, the trail was quite dangerous here. In our house, we actually do something fun. We set up our manger scene, and then we set up the wise men way on the other side of the house. And every day we move them. And they arrive at the manger scene on January 6th, which is the traditional day, Three Kings Day. It's just something fun we do. And my mother-in-law does it too, and we're always exchanging pictures, saying, look, they're making progress. But these Magi this year had a rough time. So, all right. Now we're going to switch to the planetarium, guys, up there. Let's see if I can get it past the... All right, so I'm going to take you to the skies of 5 BC in March as viewed from Bethlehem. There we go. There we go. So you see they're labeled Star of Bethlehem Comet. That's going to be our target. And it's kind of hard to tell here, but let me show you. This is Scorpius here, Scorpio. This is Sagittarius. And right over here is Capricorn, Capricornus right here. So the star starts right here. And let's zoom in a little bit so you can see here. This is the constellation Chien-Yu right here. See, the comet's nearby. It's not exactly in it, but what is in the constellation is adjustable, but we're still pretty early here. We're still in the early March. The month has just begun. But here's the constellation. There's the comet. Let's step forward. And like I said, I've got it set for the time and everything. So let's start stepping forward. This is in the early morning sky, by the way. So, and by the way, if you note down here, it says -4. You're like, wait, I thought you said 5 BC. Well, it turns out there was no year 0. It was before it was set around 500 AD before the 0 had been invented. All right. So what happens is it went 5 BC, 4 BC, 3 BC, 2 BC, 1 BC, 1 AD, 2 AD, 3 AD, 4 AD. And so when you do it with computations, you have a 0, so you can do the calculations. So, all right. So we're in March 17th, early morning sky. Let's turn back. We don't want the sun to rise too early. I want it to still be dark. And there's our star, our comet right there. It's just a little bitty thing right now. So that's good. By the way, you'll see the moon zip through every month. There goes the moon. I'm going one day. One step is one day. Can you see that? So there it is. It's starting to get a tail. And there's the constellation Chinyu. We're now in April. Let's move this over a little bit. And this is, by the way, this is Capricorn here. It's sort of shaped like a boomerang. This is the constellation Capricornus. And there's the star, or the comet, rather. I'll step forward in time. Notice it's moving a little bit, but it's staying near that constellation. Right now it's starting to get closer to the Earth and starting to develop a tail. I'm now May 21st. So we're nearly 70 days already. So it's stayed in that one region of the sky. It's not fixed, but it's staying very close to that region, which is very unusual for a comet. Usually it's going to be halfway across the sky by now. All right, we'll pass one. You notice it's starting to get brighter. Did you catch that? It's getting pretty close to the Earth. June 4th, June 5th, June 6th, June 7th. We go to the morning of June 8th. Now it's getting pretty spectacular. Now we're going to do the fun stuff here. All right, so can you see this here? This is south, and this is the zenith. So I've kind of distorted a little bit. If we were in a planetarium, we could put it on the dome. So there's the comet. It is early in the morning. It's 3 in the morning from Bethlehem. Let me turn this. All right. So the Magi, at least in my reconstruction, the Magi have come to Jerusalem. They've got a good night's sleep. They got up and they're observing the comet, the star. And they thought, this is amazing. We've never seen anything like this. So they're packing up in the early morning. So now we're going to go to use the time here. Step forward. It's getting brighter and brighter. But now the sun starts rising over in the east. Okay? I'm going to tilt this just a little bit so you can see the sunrise. So here's south. Remember I told you? It's just to the right of south. So that's where the comet is. Now watch what happens to the comet as I go forward. By the way, I don't know if you caught it, but watch what the stars are doing. They're rising in the east and moving across to the west. They're familiar with this, but watch what the comet does. It stops moving west and starts moving up. And to the astronomers, that would have been absolutely extraordinary. Notice it's also daytime. Watch what happens to the comet next. So they're walking toward Bethlehem, which is this direction right here. So we can kind of turn it the direction they're walking. It's about like that. And there's the comet right in front of them. Okay? Let's do the time up. And it gets a little, let's do that so we can see the top of the sky. The sun's getting, it's now 7:40, 8 o'clock. Look at the comet. It's getting high. The sun is going east to west. You can see it going there. But the comet's doing something absolutely extraordinary. It's going up, 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 up. And by the way, if I click on the comet, we can actually get, if you can read it over there, we can actually get the elevation, azimuth elevation right here. It's now 85 degrees. Oh, wait, wrong way. 84 degrees, 85 degrees, 86 degrees, 87 it gets about 86 degrees, which is just a few degrees from directly overhead. And for all intents and purposes, it's now directly overhead. Meanwhile, the sun is coming up from the east. And like I said, the astronomers, one, here's this object they can see in the daytime. And two, the sun is moving, the stars are moving, this object's staying right up there because it's passing so close to the Earth from our scientific understanding. All right, let's go back to the slides. Perfect, thank you. All right, so here's the path of the comet from the 70 days. It stays right near the constellation Chin-Yu. Okay? And here's the path that you just saw. The sun rises in the east, comes up, it's near local noon, a little bit towards the south. This is near the solstice, so the sun's pretty high. And it goes, and during that morning, this comet, before dawn, is moving normally, and then right after dawn, it stays near this line. This is the line, this is the Jerusalem-Bethlehem road direction. And it stays right along there, rising for a couple of hours, and then stays near the zenith for several hours, which is exactly the description in the book of Matthew. So a couple hours would have taken them to walk to Bethlehem, and a couple of hours overhead. It always bugged me that we always show the wise men, magi, arriving at night, right? People didn't really travel at night. I mean, they did sometimes. Because there were robbers, bandits, there were road hazards. But could the comet have really been that bright? Well, so I did some work with comet brightnesses. It turns out that they would have had to see the comet when it reached what's called magnitude 3.5. That's about the minimum that an observer... It's quite dim. If you've ever seen a comet that's 3.5, it's a tough object. It's really a binocular object. I mean, you could see it. In Houston, you can't see it, but out in the country, you could probably see it. But as it got closer, I put in several possible curves. These are actually quite bright intrinsically comets. So there may have been something like an early... what is called an outburst. It could have been bright at first. But it started out dim, but by the time they arrived on June 8th, it could have been as bright as the full moon, in which case it would have been clearly visible in the daytime. And remember it said, and when they saw the star, they rejoiced with exceeding great joy, because they'd never seen anything like it before, at least in my theory. Right? The comet would have remained dim for many weeks after discovery. Only professional astronomers would have noticed it. Only when it became extra bright would everybody have noticed. And remember what Herod asked. When did the star appear? Because he wouldn't have known about it. Only the astronomers would have known about it. All right, there's the hypothesis. This is what I'm presenting to you as my Christmas gift this year. But the question is, there are some doubts about this. So I didn't mention this. Last year, I had written the paper and had not yet submitted it. It has now been submitted. It's gone through peer review and has been accepted for publication in the Journal of the British Astronomical Association. So maybe by next year, you'll be able to get a copy of the journal article, or you can read it or whatever. It's a lot more detail in the thing, all the calculations and everything. But one of the criticisms would be, well, and you'll see this in lots of material, comets were thought to be harbingers of doom. They were thought to be bad omens. And certainly in the Greco-Roman world, that was mostly true. But like most things, it's not 100% true. I list Charon the Stoic, Hephaestion of Thebes, Avienus, Pliny the Elder, and even John Liddus gives examples when the comets can be omens of good tidings, at least for one side. John Liddus has the Romans and the Persians at war, and the Persians win. It's like, well, that's bad for the Romans, but good for the Persians. So maybe what's good for one side is bad for the other. So strictly speaking, it wasn't always a bad omen. Now, we talked about Julius Caesar and Augustus Caesar. When Julius was assassinated, and later Augustus became emperor, after Julius died, there was a comet seen in the sky. It's called I forgot the name. It has a name, but it's 44 BC. It's called the Julius Caesar comet. There's a book about it, but written by an astronomer and a historian and they actually got the inspiration from them because they worked out the orbit of this comet. And he minted this wonderful coin here. So there's Augustus Caesar there. And you can see it's a star. It says Divus Julius, the divine Julius. And see, it actually has a tail. It's a comet. It's a comet coin. And he announced the comet was the spirit of the recently deified Julius, ascending to heaven. So he turned what was often thought to be a negative into a positive omen. Previously, there was a fellow named Mithridates the Great of Pontus who claimed that 2 comets, one that appeared at his birth in 134 BC and one that appeared at his coronation in 119, well, that means that I am going to be a great king. That was how his propaganda for that was. So as you can see, the Greco-Roman attitudes toward comets were a bit nuanced. But you might say, wait a second, Magi weren't from the Greco-Roman world, they were from the East. So how did they feel about comets? Mesopotamian scholars had compiled omen texts that were a little bit different from what you think of as astrology. What they would do is when they would see something in the sky or on earth, they would interpret what that meant. And it usually had something to do with the king or the kingdom. It wasn't about a personal thing. It was about what was happening in the world. And we can't put the tablets in the Magi's hands, but they were certainly accessible to them. That body of knowledge was accessible to them. One of them is called the Enuma Anu Enlil. Honestly, that's really the name. It's 70 tablets. It's an encyclopedia of omen texts. And because it's in clay, it's preserved. Certain omens, they have both positive and negative, were about the motions of the planets. Some were about the appearances of the sun and the moon, eclipses, earthquakes, meteorological phenomena such as thunder and rainbows. And they give the instructions on what they mean. Does it affect crop yields? Does it affect commodity prices? Does it affect the weather, wars, disease, the rise and fall of kings and kingdoms? The kind of stuff we look for in the newspaper, right? That was what they were looking for. Now, how did they interpret comets? Well, it turns out that there are several words they use, but the one that's unambiguously common is the word zalumu. And it was known, there were a series of observations that were made in the ancient Mesopotamia that are called observation diaries. And we know this because they actually recorded the appearances of Halec's comet in 164 B and 87 BC. That's actually one of those tablets there. It's at the British Museum. So they call Halec's comet a zalumu. So we know at least sometimes a zalumu is a comet. It turns out that the zalumu omens are actually on parts of tablets that are fragmentary and unpublished. So I had to do a little sleuthing. At least one of the omens, so several of them are negative omens. You see a zalumu, it's a bad day. But I found one omen with the help of a cuneiform scientist, and it actually has to be reconstructed from those 3 tablets. So let's go to that omen. If a zalumu appears in the raven star in the entire land, pregnant women will bring their fetuses to term, the cattle will give birth easily, the fish in the river will spawn, the bird in the sky will hatch eggs. That's a positive omen, because there's one right after it that says, if it appears in this constellation, then women will not bring their fetuses to term, the cattle will not give birth, etc., etc. So this is even though this has nothing to do with Capricornus, the raven star is the constellation Corvus for you astronomers. It does show that comets were not universally interpreted as evil omens in Mesopotamia. The problem is there are at least 4 or 5 of the zalumu omens which we can't figure out what they say because they're not preserved well enough. All it says, if a zalumu in, and then we lose the tablet. So maybe more discoveries in the future will help fill out our encyclopedia of omens. Now there's another Enuma Anu Enlil volume called 56, which is about an object called a bibu, believe it or not. The word means a wild goat or wild goat star. And the idea is a wild goat wanders among the hills. And these are objects that move among the background stars. Now, sometimes it's clear they're referring to meteors. But sometimes they talk about bibu that last multiple nights. And meteors last at most a few seconds, right? Sometimes they're talking about planets. It's very clear they're talking about planets. But it also talks about them going to constellations where the planets don't go, like the Big Dipper. So clearly it's not always planets. The author that translated this tablet said that the comet is a bibu par excellence. It's the ideal bibu because it can do all the things that they describe. So there's a number of different omens. There we go. So here's the omen, line 35, 36. If a Bibu approaches another Bibu, the son of a king who lives in a town on my border will make rebellion against his father, but will not seize the throne. The son of a nobody will emerge and seize the throne. He will return the temples, God's temples, to their former conditions. He will establish regular offerings for the great gods. He will provision the temples equally. This is a positive omen about a non-royal king. And it's in the borderlands of the kingdom. And where was Judea? It's in the borderlands between Rome and Parthia. So they could have interpreted this omen, or one like it, as indicating a new king in one of their border things. Well, you say that, okay, that's interesting. But how did they go to Judea? Well, let's talk about that. Ancient scholars also developed a method of astrological geography. That's where they would associate a constellation with a particular region on the map. The most famous list is from the 2nd century AD, from Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, where he assigned Judea to the constellation Aries. However, that's from the 2nd century. In the 1st century BC, they used a different map. And look where Capricorn is. I should have said Capricorn because it's a zodiac sign. This earliest list does not specifically mention Judea, but it mentions Syria. And at this time, Syria was composed of two regions, the Roman province of Syria and the kingdom of Judea. So, which one was it? You're a magi. You've got the object is in Capricornus or Capricorn. You think you should go to Syria. Well, if you're looking for a royal birth, then the province of Syria is the wrong place to look, because it had been a Roman province since 64 BC. No royal family at all. But inside Syria is the kingdom of Judea. That's the obvious place to go. So just a summary here. Ancient comet omens could sometimes be positive. There were Mesopotamian omens that associate comets with changes in royal dynasties and regions along the borders of Parthia. And also the Magi likely would have been sent by the king of Parthia to check things out. Just to gather intelligence, find out what's happening with the royal families along the border between Rome. Just wanted to be aware. And the astrological geography of the time associates the constellation Capricornus with Syria and Judea. So that gives at least some of the reason, perhaps, why they came. So, of course, astrological omen interpretations are notoriously fluid. Omens include things beyond merely astronomical phenomena, meteorological events, thunder, earthquakes. And we know from both biblical and Greek records that Magi interpreted dreams. For all we know, they had a dream that encouraged them to go. And, of course, we can't access that information. So at this point, we can't connect all the dots, but it's very intriguing that there's most of the pieces are there to explain why they came to Judea. Another, why is the bright, by the way, I'm over time and I apologize. My wife knows I enjoy talking. My Sunday school class knows I enjoy talking. Why did the bright comet appear, why does it not appear in other sources? So we have it in a Chinese record and we have it in the Bible. Why is it not in the Greco-Roman records? Well, it turns out that period of time, the last decade of the 1st century BC, was a period of very poor coverage in our Roman history. Josephus is our guide for the reign of King Herod, but he rarely mentions astronomical events. He doesn't mention the comet that appeared when Julius Caesar died in 44 BC. He doesn't mention Halley's comet 12 BC. So the fact that he doesn't mention a comet in 5 BC is not proof that it didn't happen. Now, there was a fellow who loved comets. His name was Cassius Dio, and he wrote a history of the Roman world. He, in fact, is the only Roman historian to mention Halley's comet in 12 BC. Well, I'm reading along in Cassius Dio to see if it includes, and in his book 55, he starts describing the events of 5 BC, and it cuts off and doesn't pick up again until 2 BC. That section is just lost to history, unfortunately. So if he did mention a comet, it's not there anymore. What about ancient Mesopotamian astronomers? They looked at the skies. One famous fragment of what's called the Astronomical Almanac, it was sort of just like a farmer's almanac about where the planets would be. It's been preserved from 7 to 6 BC. It's often used in descriptions of various planetary conjunction theories. And I mentioned this last year, I think it's still true. About 76 BC, sometime in that period, an astronomer in Babylon wrote that tablet. For all we know, that's the handwriting of one of the Magi. But again, it only mentions planets and doesn't cover 5 BC. They also made diaries. That's where we know where they saw Halley's Comet. But the latest diaries we have are from 61 BC. They stopped. Either they stopped recording the information or they moved to some other perishable material like papyrus, and it's just lost. So unfortunately, that would be great if we had Mesopotamian observations. What about coins? Now, there's a fellow named Michael Molar who has a book called The Star of Bethlehem, The Legacy of the Magi, and he actually talks about planetary astrology, and he speculates that this coin, which has Aries and the star, is linked to an event that happened in 6 BC. The coin was minted at Antioch in 6 AD, and he said that may be evidence of the star, which is his theory. Well, I said, well, we can look at coins. It turns out that Caesar Augustus, for reasons we don't fully understand, associated his kingdom with Capricorn. The reason why we don't understand it, because it's not his birth sign. We don't know why he associated with Capricorn. And in this coin he made in 18 or 17 BC, and there says Augustus, and there's Capricorn. See, he's a fish goat. And there's a globe here, because he rules the whole world. It's got a rudder, because he's steering the Roman Empire on a steady course. And on his back is a cornucopia, because it's the Roman peace. It's wonderful for everybody, right? There's a whole bunch of coins minted like this. He also minted this coin. And the thing there says Receptus Signus Parthicus, which is the dedication they had received the Cygnus, the standards back from the Parthians. And he commemorated again with Capricorn. But this one doesn't have all the globes and everything, but it's just that. Sometime, either between this and the time Jesus was born, somewhere around there, he made this coin, which has Capricorn with a bright star above it. The problem is we don't know when it was minted. There's some evidence it was minted earlier than 5 BC, but we just don't know right now. But right after Jesus was born, at least according to my theory, this pattern began being copied all around the Roman Empire. Here's one from 3 to 2 BC from Alexandria. 1 to 5 AD from Alexandria. 84 from Cyprus. AD 22 from Cilicia. And unfortunately, when I was in Vienna, I didn't know this was there. I would have looked at it. This is called the Gemma Augustea. It's a beautiful piece from the period of Augustus's reign, dated to AD 10 or later. If you look right up here, there's a little circle right above here, above Augustus's head, and it's Capricorn, and look at that star behind it with the rays. So clearly he had this theme of the star associated, bright star. So whether it was inspired by the comet we described or not, it's very intriguing. Here's the dates on the coins. I just arranged them. Here's 5 BC, and here's where the coins and things are. And here I just put a question mark around this one. It'd be nice to figure that one out. More work for me to do, right? All right. Why doesn't the Chinese appear in other ancient stories? In summary, due to the haphazard nature of how archaeological evidence and ancient texts were preserved, we can't yet confirm or eliminate the bright comet hypothesis. It's plausible, but we don't have proof. One that came up from one of the reviewers was, wait a second, this comet passed, according to my theory, between 390,000 kilometers of the Earth. That's roughly the distance of the Earth to the Moon. That's very, very close. And he, like I did, looked on our history of close comets to the Earth. We've never seen one come. Now, we've only looked back a couple of hundred years since we've been understanding the orbits of comets. He said, is it likely that one would come that close? Well, I did some calculations to show that you would expect that close every several thousand years. But I was at a meeting a few weeks ago and was reminded that on October 19th, 2014, comet C-2013-A1 sighting spring passed 140,000 kilometers from the planet Mars. 1/3 the distance I'm talking about. In fact, it passed so close that my colleagues in the Meteorite Environment Office were checking to make sure the dusty coma didn't affect our satellites in orbit around Mars, our Mars probes. And the orbital mechanics, I worked it out, indicate that we would expect the rate at which it passed close to Earth to be similar, if not even higher. So it's plausible. And I found this wonderful picture from the Hubble telescope, a composite image of the comet, and there's Mars. See how big the comet is? It's a little bitty thing, but the dust cloud is planet size. That's why they're so bright. So it's plausible. Rare, but plausible that one could come that close, given enough time. All right, the last one is kind of a fun one. 2 years and younger. That's how old the children were that Herod wanted to kill, right? But I said the comet was up for 70 days. How does that match up? Well, it turns out that in Asia, until recently, traditional Asian dating is that when a newborn child is born, that child is 1 year old. And when the new year comes, the child is 2 years old. So you can literally have a child a few days old that is, quote, 2 years old. It was only changed in South Korea like a year or two ago that they changed. You may have read about it. Well, that's Far Eastern Asia. What about, we're talking about the Middle East. Well, it turns out Roman-era papyri from Egypt of local census data indicate that sometimes that method was used in Egypt at this time in the 1st century BC, in the 1st century AD. So that indicates that this method may have been more widespread than previously known. Well, all right, if that's true, what does that mean? Well, Babylonian records indicate that the beginning of their new year in 5 BC began on April 8th, the month after the Chinese saw the comet. So by Babylonian record, when Herod asked, what month did the comet appear? They would have said, oh, the last month of the previous year. And if they used this dating mechanism, the child would have been, quote, 2 years old, right? Now, the question is, what with the Jewish calendar? Well, if you plug into your formulas on the internet, you will get the various months in the Jewish calendar. But that's based on a method that was used developed in the Middle Ages. At this time, they sort of winged it. The Sanhedrin, because the first month of the Jewish year, first month is the month of Passover. So they would wait until the barley harvest was ripe. And then they would declare, all right, it's the new year. If not, they'd say, oh, we're going to stick a leap month at the end. Okay, that's what they would do. And so it is possible that the Jewish calendar that year aligned with the Babylonian calendar. So like I said, when Herod asked the Magi when the star appeared, they would have said, well, the last month of the previous year. And Herod's order might have meant, therefore, kill any children born this year or last year. And that fits into the chronology that I've proposed. All right. In summary, the Chinese observed a comet in the spring of 5 BC, the right timing to be the star Bethlehem. 2, there is a comet orbit that fits both the Chinese observations and the plain language of Matthew 2 about the star traveling before and standing over. The comet would have been extraordinarily bright when it passed close to the sun and in early June, and consistent with the Magi traveling during the daylight, which people usually did in the ancient world. The omen texts in Mesopotamia and early Greek views of astrological geography provide clues how the Magi might have interpreted such a comet in the sky. And papyri from Egypt indicate that 2 years old and younger could mean born last year or this year, which is consistent with the Chinese comet observations. And of course, confirming data may yet exist in untranslated or undiscovered cuneiform tablets or other archaeological clues. I'm still digging. Okay. So I think the summary of all this, and I'm sorry I kept you all late, but the summary is we can no longer say, quote, no astronomical event can behave this way, because I've proposed an astronomical event that could have behaved that way. So, and I did this last year too. This whole process is dedicated to 2 people. My mother, who always loved the Star Bethlehem presentation at the Planetarium. She's the one that got me interested in it in the first place. And my first boss at the Noble Planetarium, Don Garland, who I know would have loved to put this on the big dome. He would have just loved it. And I also want to thank my wife and my daughter and Ashley Johnson for their editorial help. And Merry Christmas.